Hello and welcome to the Bible Difficulties and Answers podcast. I'm your host, Lance Smith. Today, we're embarking on a thought-provoking journey into the depths of Genesis 6, 14 through 15. Our focus, the flood narrative. Was this flood an actual historical event or simply a myth, much like the Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, or perhaps something in between, a mytho-history? First, let's dive into the question of whether the flood truly occurred. What evidence do we have, if any, to support this event as historical fact? And if it did happen, how on earth could Noah's Ark have housed all the species of animals, enough food, and humans for such an extensive journey? This brings us to a fascinating point of discussion, the use of the word kind instead of species. Does this term provide a different perspective that might make the story more plausible? We'll explore these questions and more in today's episode. But remember, there's a wealth of statistical data and detailed research that we can't fully cover in this short time. So be sure to check out the articles linked in the episode description for a deeper dive. As usual, I'll present a number of different opinions from my research and conclude with my own thoughts. Show notes will include links to all we discuss. Are you ready to dive in? All right, let's learn together. Let's take a look at Genesis 6, 14 through 15 from the New Living Translation. Build a large boat from cypress wood and waterproof it with tar, inside and out. Then construct decks and stalls throughout its interior. Make the boat 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. Now, the problem, as defined by the Big Book of Bible Difficulties, is this. The Bible says Noah's Ark was only 45 feet high, 75 feet wide, and 450 feet long. Noah was told to take 2 of every kind of unclean animal and 7 of every kind of clean animal, as we see in verse 19 and in chapter 7, verse 2. But scientists inform us that there are between 1/2 billion to over 1 billion species of animals. Now, the solution, and again as defined by the Big Book of Bible Difficulties, is this. First, the modern concept of species is not the same as a kind in the Bible. There are probably only several hundred different kinds of land animals that would have to be taken into the ark. The sea animals stayed in the sea, and many species could have survived in egg form. Second, the ark was not small. It was a huge structure, the size of a modern ocean liner. Furthermore, it had 3 stories, which tripled its space to a total of 1.5 million cubic feet. Third, Noah could have taken younger or smaller varieties of some larger animals. Given all these factors, there was plenty of room for all the animals, food for the trip, and the 8 humans aboard. All right, back to me. For our purposes today, we're going to explore 2 viewpoints in depth. On one side, we have the argument that the flood is a myth, possibly serving as a symbolic or allegorical tale, similar to other ancient narratives. This perspective, often referred to as mytho-history, suggests that the story is a blend of mythological elements and historical memories crafted to convey a moral or spiritual lesson. On the other side, we consider the possibility of the flood being a real historical event. Now let's explore the first myth and mytho-history arguments. To begin, we will go with one of our podcast favorites, Dr. William Lane Craig, from his September 4th, 2019 Defenders Podcast, Series 3, Excursus on Creation of Life and Biological Diversity, Part 27. This is entitled, The Scientific Evidence Pertinent to the Origin and Evolution of Biological Complexity. Craig, as usual, makes a well-reasoned claim on the flood and Noah's Ark as mytho-history, this time specifically going after young Earth creationists to make his point. As he details in his podcast with the following, and I quote, looking at Jonathan Safarte's Young Earth Creationist commentary on Genesis 1 through 11, in order to explain flood geology, Safarte supposes that after the flood, the animals that Noah had taken on board disembarked and then filled the entire world. Now, how do you suppose that the hippopotami on board made it from the mountains of Turkey where the ark landed to the rivers of Central Africa, or how the little koala bears and platypuses crawled all the way from Turkey to Australia, or the sloths to South America? Well, Safarte's answer is that plate tectonics had not yet separated the supercontinent into the world's separate continents, thus enabling the animals to migrate to their various habitats. But they had to do it in a hurry. All the continental drift and mountain building, such as the raising of Mount Everest, all took place rapidly since the flood just a few thousand years ago. What about the dinosaurs, you might ask? Well, since they were contemporaneous with Noah, he must have taken them on board the ark too. Safarte solves the problem of room on board by suggesting that Noah took juvenile specimens, 2 of every genus. Not 2 of every species, 2 of every genus. Now, since there were at least 500 dinosaur genera, Noah must have had at least 1,000 dinosaurs on board the ark, which he then released into the world upon disembarkation. Just think about that for a minute. Only 367 years separate the flood from the call of Abraham. 367 years. That means that the whole history of dinosaur evolution and speciation plus extinction took place in less than 400 years, unless we are to think that there were still dinosaurs roaming the earth at the time of Abraham. Truly, young earth creationists live in a different universe than most of us do. This is crank science, and Christians should not be attracted to it, close quote. Now, turning back to me, I find Dr. Craig's arguments on young earth creationism quite compelling, and we'll revisit Dr. Craig's insights here in just a bit. Our next example comes from another podcast favorite, albeit not often in a positive light, the New Revised Standard Version Bible Commentary. They provide an interesting take on Genesis 6:14 through 16, explaining, and I quote, "In the Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, the hero is told to build a similar houseboat, sealing it with pitch. The description of a 3-leveled ark may be based on an ancient idea that the ark reflects the 3-part structure of both the universe and temple." Okay, I have to admit, I'm not entirely sure what that last sentence even means. It seems the commentary is implying that the account of Noah might be a borrowed narrative from earlier stories. All in all, I find Dr. Craig's analysis of most topics quite compelling. However, I can't fully embrace the idea of Noah's Ark and the flood as mytho-history. So did the flood really happen? According to Jesus, it did. In Matthew 24:37 through 39, Jesus mentions the flood, affirming its occurrence. I just find it easier to accept that the flood happened if Jesus said it did. It feels less problematic to me. But speaking of problematic, if the story is true, how could the ark have held all the species or kinds of animals? That's a question we'll delve into next. Matt Slick, in his April 30th, 2008 article, "Could Noah's Ark Hold All the Animals?" And after detailing average animal size, species, etc., and please click on the link to read all the detail he provides, concludes with this, and I quote, "That means that only 56% of the ark would be used for storing the animals. Obviously then, the rest of the space would be used for food for the people and animals in sleeping quarters. In addition, considering that insects are extremely small, it's easily conceivable that they could be housed in part of the remaining space. It should also be considered that many animals can hibernate. Additionally, predators and prey have been known to live peacefully together during situations of stress like fire, flood, or earthquake. In the ark, animal behavior probably would have been different from normal daily life. Specialists in animal behavior have noted that animals can sense danger and have often migrated to escape it. Perhaps God used their migratory instincts to get them into the ark," close quote. Now, our next bit of research is one we could have parked and reviewed this entire podcast. Again, here's another article link I would encourage you to read and review. Dr. Tim Chaffee, on the November 24th, 2023, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist podcast with Frank Turek, discussed the ark and housing all the animals. Allow me to read some of this podcast directly here. All right, beginning with Frank Turek. "How about the objection that there are 1 million species of animals out there? There's no way any boat could contain them all. So how would you respond to that?" Tim Chaffee. "Yeah, when you look at like the IUCN Red List, that's what we use for the endangered species list, they have 1.77 or 1.78 million species that have been identified. But what people don't tell you is that this includes all of the marine creatures, which is where the vast majority of life is on Earth. That includes all the microorganisms, one-celled organisms, bacteria, all that kind of thing. It includes all the plants. No, they didn't have to bring any of those. It includes over 1 million species of insects, which he most likely didn't have to bring those either. They don't really fit the criteria of the creatures that are going on board the ark. And so, when you're talking about the land animals or land-dependent animals, we've only ever discovered about 40,000 total. That includes fossil records and everything. And that's of the species. But Noah didn't have to bring every species. He just needs 2 of each kind. And so when you think about wolves and coyotes and dingoes, those are all dogs. Noah just needs 2 dogs. You don't need 2 of each of these different species. And so the number really gets down to about 1,400, and they fit in there just fine. Back to Frank Turek. 1,400 kinds? I know that is a bit controversial biologically. The difference between, first of all, what is a species and what is a kind. And biologically, they don't even use the word kind, do they? What do they use? Back to Tim Chaffee. No, kind comes from the Bible. The Hebrew word is min. And so it's according to their kind. They would talk about species and genus and family. We would say that the kind is roughly equivalent to the family level in our classification system, the kind of Linnaean taxonomy that we use. So when you think about the bears, you have polars and grizzlies and pandas and brown bears and black bears. There are lots of different species, but they're all within the bear family. We would say that all of those are part of the same kind. And so Noah just needs 2 bears. He doesn't need 2 of each of those. Now, we know that polar bears and grizzlies can mix. You can get a growler or a pizzly, depending on which one's the male. And so you can get crosses between a lot of those. And so if the creatures can interbreed, they belong in the same kind. That was our first criteria. Sometimes you don't have all the data available. With fossils, you can't see if the fossils can breed. So you have to look at the anatomy and just see, do they look like they belong in the same kind based on their structure? And then, if you have genetic information, you can test that as well to see if they belong in the same kind. So we had 3 criteria as far as whether or not creatures belong in the same one. And yes, just under 1,400. And that's using probably a high estimate, because if we didn't have all the data we needed, we separated them out, even though we strongly suspected they belonged to the same kind. Now, remember last week when I mentioned we might hear from Dr. Hugh Ross again? Well, here's an interesting tidbit he adds to the conversation from his July 1st, 2016 article, Which Animals Rode on the Ark, where he says, and I quote, "Since humans had not yet become globally distributed," and we see that in Genesis 10 through 11:9, "the flood need not have extended beyond the regions inhabited by humans. Thus, there would have been no need for Noah's Ark to rescue, for example, polar bears and emperor penguins," close quote. Okay, so interestingly, those areas, because of their climate and lack of human habitation, would have been affected by the flood. So we're faced with 2 options. Is the story mytho-history? Or if we accept its occurrence, how do we explain the variety of species on board? Personally, I firmly believe that the story of Noah and his ark is not just a myth, it actually happened. And today we delved into several detailed explanations for how the ark could have accommodated them all, estimating around 1,400 kinds of animals. Some estimates even suggest that the ark was only 56% full of animal life, leaving the remainder for food and sleeping quarters for Noah and his family. Jesus affirmed the flood, and I stand with Jesus on this. The explanations provided make perfect sense to me. In our next episode, we're staying right here in Genesis 6:14 through 15 as we explore how a wooden ark could have survived such a violent flood. You may reach us at our website, BibleDifficultiesAndAnswers.podbean.com, or you may reach out to me directly at our email address, BibleDifficultiesAndAnswers@gmail.com, with any questions, comments, concerns, fits of righteous indignation, or just to say hi. Also, please like and subscribe to this podcast. Tell a friend or 2 as well. And also write a review and give it a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, Podbean, Spotify, or any of your podcast venues of choice. It really does help get the word out about the most amazing book ever written. Again, I'm Lance Smith. Until next time, I wish you good luck, good health, and God bless. So long.